Charlotte Greer's hands didn't shake anymore. That was what 15 years could do. 15 years of distance from the moment everything changed. 15 years of quiet mornings and simple routines. 15 years of letting the past become something that happened to someone else. She stood in her small kitchen in West Haven, watching the coffee maker bubble and hiss, listening to the familiar sounds of the town waking up beyond her window. Saturday morning meant the farmers' market would open soon in the town square. She could hear Mrs. Henderson's old truck rattling down Main Street, probably loaded with fresh vegetables from her garden. The bakery on the corner had been pumping out the smell of fresh bread since 5 o'clock. Charlie, everyone in town called her Charlie, was 68 years old, though she moved like someone younger. Her hair had gone completely silver, which she kept in a practical shortcut that required no fussing. Her face showed the lines of a life lived outdoors, and her blue eyes still held a sharpness that occasionally surprised people who expected elderly meant soft. She poured her coffee into her favorite mug, the one with a faded picture of a lighthouse, and sat at her small kitchen table. Through the window, she could see her tiny garden, where tomatoes were just beginning to ripen. Beyond that, the neighbor's cat prowled along the fence line, probably hunting for birds. This was her life now. Simple, predictable, safe. It hadn't always been this way. 28 years ago, Charlie had stood in a very different place, a military training facility in Virginia, wearing a crisp uniform, her hair pulled back in a regulation bun. She'd been 40 years old then, already a veteran with 15 years of service, but she was about to start something entirely new. "Sergeant Greer," her commanding officer had said, "you've been selected for a specialized program. EODK-9 handler training. You'll be working with explosive detection dogs, EOD explosive ordnance disposal, the people who found bombs before they exploded, the people who walked toward danger while everyone else ran away." "Yes, sir," she'd said without hesitation. She'd always been good with dogs. Growing up on a farm in Montana, she'd trained working dogs to help with cattle, to track, to protect. When she'd joined the military at 25, that skill had seemed irrelevant. But the military had a way of finding what you were good at and putting it to use. The training had been intense. She learned about different types of explosives, military ordnance, improvised devices, chemical compounds. She learned how dogs' noses worked, how they could detect microscopic particles of explosive material, how to train them to alert without disturbing a potential bomb. She learned to read a dog's body language as precisely as a doctor reads a patient's vital signs. And then she met Rex. Rex was a 2-year-old German shepherd, all black except for tan markings on his legs and face. He'd been bred specifically for this work. Intelligent, focused, energetic, but controlled. The first time Charlie walked into his kennel, Rex had looked at her with those dark, intelligent eyes, and she'd known. This was her partner. This was her. They trained together for 6 months before their first deployment. Charlie learned every detail of Rex's personality, how he tilted his head when he was thinking, how his tail wagged differently when he was excited versus when he was alerting to a scent, how he would lean against her leg when he was tired. Rex learned to trust Charlie completely, to look to her for guidance in situations that would terrify most creatures. The story is developing well. I'm establishing Charlie's character and her past. I need to continue building the story towards the required length of 35,000 words. I should develop the relationship with Rex, the traumatic event, her move to West Haven, her life there, meeting Scout, the suspicious strangers, and finally, the climax. Let me continue with the narrative. Their first deployment was to Afghanistan. Charlie remembered stepping off the plane into heat so intense it felt like opening an oven door. The air tasted like dust and diesel fuel. Rex had been tense but focused, his ears pricked forward, taking in every new smell and sound. "Welcome to Camp Leatherneck Sergeant," a dusty Marine had said, barely glancing at her. "We've got 3 suspicious packages that need checking." "Your dog ready?" "Always," Charlie had replied. That first day set the pattern for the next 10 years. They went where the bombs were, or where bombs might be. They cleared roads before convoys passed. They searched buildings before troops entered. They investigated suspicious packages, unmarked vehicles, abandoned equipment. Sometimes they found explosives. Sometimes they didn't. Every time they went out, both of their lives depended on Rex's nose and Charlie's judgment. They deployed 5 times: Afghanistan twice, Iraq twice, and once to an undisclosed location that Charlie still couldn't talk about even all these years later. Between deployments, they were home at Fort Campbell, training, maintaining their skills, teaching others. Rex wasn't just her working partner. He was her best friend. In the quiet moments, when they weren't on duty, Rex would curl up next to her, his head on her lap, and she would scratch behind his ears and tell him about her day. He seemed to understand. Maybe he did. Other soldiers came and went. Some became friends, but most remained acquaintances. In that world of danger and discipline, Rex was her constant. He never judged her, never disappointed her, never left her, until he did. Their last mission together happened on a Tuesday. Charlie remembered because she'd been thinking about how Tuesdays back home had been her favorite day. The day she'd take Rex to the park if they weren't training, let him run and play like a normal dog. They were in a city. Charlie didn't like to remember which one, didn't like to remember the name, the street, the building. Just a city, a street, a building. Keeping it abstract helped. The building was suspected of housing a bomb-making operation. Their job was to clear it, to make sure it was safe before a full search team went in. Standard procedure. They'd done it hundreds of times. Charlie remembered the heat that day. Remembered Rex panting as they approached the building, his tongue lolling out. She'd given him water from her canteen, poured it into her hand so he could lap it up. "Good boy," she'd told him. "Just like always. You got this." They entered through the front door, which had been breached by the entry team. The building was old, concrete, and tile, the kind of structure that retained heat like a brick oven. It smelled of garbage and something chemical that made Charlie's nose wrinkle. Rex had gone through his routine, methodically checking each room on the ground floor. In the 3rd room, he'd alerted, sat down immediately, his signal that he'd detected explosives. Charlie had marked the location and called it in. The bomb team would handle it. Their job was just to find them. They'd move to the 2nd floor. More rooms, more heat, more suspicious smells. Rex had checked the first 2 rooms. Nothing. The 3rd room had a closed door. Charlie had opened it carefully. The room was empty except for some old furniture and boxes. Rex had entered, sniffing. And then, she'd seen it in his body language, the sudden tension. He'd alerted, but not with his usual calm sit. Instead, he'd barked, sharp, urgent, warning. "Rex, come!" Charlie had commanded, backing toward the door, but Rex hadn't come. He'd been focused on something under a table, and then he'd moved toward it, still barking. That was when Charlie had seen the wire. "Rex! N-O! Come!" But it was too late. Rex had stepped on something. There was a mechanical click, and Charlie's training had taken over. She'd thrown herself backward through the doorway, and then the world had exploded into noise and fire and pain. She'd woken up in a hospital in Germany. Her ears were ringing. Her left arm was bandaged. She had cuts and bruises everywhere. A doctor was talking to her, but she couldn't hear the words, just saw his mouth moving. The first thing she'd been able to say, when her hearing started to return, "Rex?" The The doctor's face had told her everything. But he'd said it anyway. "I'm sorry, Sergeant." The dog didn't make it. The explosive device. Charlie had turned her face to the wall and hadn't spoken for 3 days. Now, sitting in her kitchen in West Haven 15 years later, Charlie took a sip of her coffee and pushed those memories away. They never really left, but she'd learned to put them in a box, to lock them away most of the time. She'd spent 6 months recovering, physically and mentally. The physical wounds had healed relatively quickly. The explosion had been smaller than it could have been, and being thrown backward had saved her life. The mental wounds had taken longer. She'd been diagnosed with PTSD and survivor's guilt. The Army had offered her therapy, medication, support. She'd taken it all. She'd worked hard at recovering. But she'd known, and the Army had known, that she couldn't go back to that work. Not without Rex. Not with the flashbacks, the nightmares, the panic attacks when she heard loud noises. They'd offered her other positions, training roles, administrative work. But Charlie couldn't imagine staying in that world without being able to do the work she'd trained for. It would be like being a pianist who'd lost their fingers but was asked to teach others to play. So, at 53 years old, she'd retired from the military. She'd taken her pension, her discharge papers, her medals, and she'd left. She'd driven west, not really knowing where she was going. She'd wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere far from the noise and chaos of military life, somewhere she could breathe. She'd stopped in small towns, stayed in motels, kept driving, and then she'd driven through West Haven. It was a Tuesday, of course it was. The town was having its weekly farmers' market. She'd stopped at a coffee shop and sat by the window, watching people mill around the market stalls. An old man was selling honey. A young woman was demonstrating a spinning wheel. Kids were chasing each other between the stalls while their parents shopped. It was peaceful, normal, real in a way that her life hadn't felt real in a long time. She'd stayed. Finding a place to live in West Haven had been easy. The town had a few rentals, and Charlie didn't need much space. She'd settled on a small house on Maple Street. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a tiny kitchen, and a backyard big enough for a garden. The rent was reasonable, and her pension covered it with money left over. "You looking for work?" Her landlord, Tom Patterson, had asked when she'd signed the lease. He was in his 60s, with a friendly face and calloused hands that spoke of a life of manual labor. "Not really," Charlie had said. "I'm retired." "Military?" He'd noticed something. Maybe her posture. Maybe the way she'd filled out the forms with precise, neat handwriting. "Yes, sir." "Thank you for your service," he'd said, and meant it. Then, "Well, if you need anything, you let me know. And if you get bored, the animal shelter is always looking for volunteers. My wife helps out there. They can always use another pair of hands." Charlie had thanked him, but hadn't thought much about it at the time. She'd been focused on settling in, on creating a space where she could feel safe. She'd unpacked her few belongings. She'd gotten rid of most of her things after leaving the military, keeping only what mattered. Photos of her parents, both deceased. A few books, clothes. The medals and certificates from her military service, which she'd packed in a box and stored in the closet without looking at them. She'd set up her bedroom simply: a bed, a dresser, a nightstand. She'd bought basic furniture for the living room: a couch, a chair, a coffee table. The kitchen came with appliances. That was all she needed. The first few months had been quiet. She'd spent her days walking around town, getting to know the layout. West Haven wasn't large, about 8,000 people, according to the sign at the town limits. It had a main street with local businesses, a grocery store, a hardware store, a few restaurants, a library. There was a small industrial area near the harbor, where fishing boats brought in their daily catches, and a few small manufacturers operated. Residential streets branched off from downtown, lined with old trees and houses of varying ages and conditions. People had been friendly but not pushy. They'd said hello, nodded, sometimes made small talk about the weather. They'd seemed to understand that she wanted to be left alone, mostly. She'd started having nightmares again. In her dreams, she was back in that building, watching Rex run toward the bomb, unable to move or speak or warn him. She'd wake up sweating, her heart pounding, reaching for a dog who wasn't there. On one particularly bad night, she'd woken at 3 a.m. and known she wouldn't get back to sleep. She'd gotten dressed and gone for a walk. The town had been silent, streetlights casting pools of yellow light on empty sidewalks. She'd walked without direction, just moving, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She'd ended up at the harbor, watching the water lap against the docks. The sound had been soothing, rhythmic, predictable. She'd sat on a bench and watched until the sky started to lighten. That was when she'd seen the building. A low, concrete structure with a hand-painted sign, West Haven Animal Shelter. She'd remembered Tom Patterson's suggestion. She'd dismissed it at first. The last thing she'd wanted was to be around dogs, to be reminded of Rex, of her failure to protect him. But sitting there in the early morning light, exhausted and lonely, she'd thought, maybe being around dogs would help. Maybe it would hurt less if she spent time with them, helped them, instead of avoiding anything that reminded her of what she'd lost. When the shelter opened at 9 that morning, Charlie had been waiting at the door. The director, a woman in her 50s named Susan Chen, had been surprised but pleased. "We can always use volunteers," Susan had said, showing Charlie around. "We're a no-kill shelter, so we keep animals until they find homes. That means we usually have between 30 and 50 dogs at any given time, plus cats and sometimes other animals. We need people to help with feeding, cleaning, walking, socializing. You interested in any particular area?" Charlie had looked around the facility. It was clean, but clearly operating on a tight budget. The dog kennels lined both sides of a long room, each containing a dog, or sometimes two. Some were barking, some were lying quietly, some were pressing their noses against the chain-link gates. "Walking," Charlie had said. "I can walk the dogs." That had been the beginning. She'd started volunteering 3 days a week, then 4, then 5. She'd come in the morning and walk dogs, one at a time, around the neighborhood near the shelter, giving them exercise and stimulation. She'd learned their names, their personalities. There was Max, an old lab mix who moved slowly, but loved gentle walks. There was Bella, a pit bull who looked tough but was afraid of her own shadow. There was Duke, a beagle who pulled constantly toward every interesting smell. None of them were Rex. That hurt at first, the reminder with every walk that her partner was gone. But gradually, the hurt faded into something else. Not healing, exactly, but acceptance. These dogs needed someone. She could be that someone. It wasn't the same as her military work, but it was something. The other volunteers and staff had accepted her easily. She didn't talk much about herself, but she showed up reliably, did good work, and treated the animals with obvious care. That was enough. Tom Patterson's wife, Marie, volunteered at the shelter too, working the front desk and helping with adoptions. She was warm and talkative, everything Charlie wasn't, but she didn't seem to mind Charlie's quiet nature. "You're good with them," Marie had commented one day, watching Charlie handle a nervous shepherd mix. "You have training?" "Some," Charlie had said, which was true. She just didn't mention that her training had involved teaching dogs to find bombs. As months passed, Charlie had integrated into West Haven's community without meaning to. She'd become a regular at the coffee shop downtown, where the owner, Jerry, learned to have her coffee ready when she came in each morning. She'd started shopping at the farmer's market, buying vegetables from Mrs. Henderson and honey from old Mr. Carlyle. She'd joined the library and become friendly with the librarian, a young woman named Amy, who recommended books and never asked personal questions. People knew her as Charlie, the quiet woman who volunteered at the shelter, who kept to herself but was always polite, who walked around town with whichever shelter dog needed exercise that day. They didn't know about her military service. They didn't know about EOD. They didn't know about Rex. She'd wanted it that way. This was a fresh start, a chance to be someone other than Sergeant Greer, the soldier who'd failed to save her partner. The years had passed quietly. Charlie had settled into routines, found comfort in repetition. She'd continued volunteering at the shelter, watching dogs come and go as they found homes. She'd tended her garden, growing tomatoes and zucchini and herbs. She'd read books, taken walks, existed peacefully. The nightmares had become less frequent. She'd learned techniques from her therapy sessions that helped: grounding exercises, breathing patterns, ways to redirect her thoughts when they went to dark places. She'd never been completely free of the memories, but they'd lost their sharp edges, become something she could live with. She'd made a few friends in her way. Marie Patterson had become a genuine confidant, someone Charlie could have coffee with and talk about simple things: garden pests, shelter gossip, town politics. Jerry from the coffee shop always asked about her day and seemed genuinely interested in the answer. Amy from the library shared Charlie's love of mystery novels, and they'd formed an informal book club of two, meeting once a month to discuss whatever they'd read. By the time Charlie turned 68, she'd been in West Haven for 12 years. The town felt like home in a way nowhere else ever had. She knew the rhythms of the seasons, when the fishing boats came in with the best catch, when the farmer's market would have fresh corn, when the town would set up the Christmas lights on Main Street. She knew people, and they knew her, in that casual, comfortable way of a small community. She'd thought this was how she'd spend the rest of her life, peacefully, quietly, with her past firmly in the past. She'd been wrong. The dog came into the shelter on a Tuesday in early September. Charlie noticed the day because Tuesdays still carried a weight for her, even after all these years. She'd been at the shelter since morning, had already walked 3 dogs, and was taking a break in the volunteer room when Susan came in with a worried expression. "Charlie, can you help me with something?" "Of course." Susan led her to the intake area, where a young dog was cowering in a crate. The dog was maybe a year old, a medium-sized mix that looked like golden retriever and maybe Labrador, with some other breeds thrown in. His coat was light brown, almost golden, but matted and dirty. He was thin, ribs visible, and his eyes were wide with fear. "Found him wandering on Route 7, Susan explained. "No collar, no microchip. Animal control brought him in an hour ago. He's terrified. Won't let anyone near him. I was hoping you might have better luck." Charlie knelt down near the crate, not too close, and just sat quietly. She'd learned long ago that frightened animals needed time and space, not forced interaction. The dog watched her with those scared eyes. "Hey there," Charlie said softly. "You're okay. Nobody's going to hurt you." She stayed there for 20 minutes, just sitting, occasionally speaking in a calm voice. The dog stayed pressed against the back of the crate, but gradually his body relaxed slightly. His ears, which had been flat against his head, perked up a little when she talked. "That's progress," Susan said. "You want to try feeding him?" "Maybe food will help." Charlie took a bowl of dog food and set it near the crate opening, then backed away. The dog's nose twitched. He was hungry, that was obvious. After a long moment, he crept forward and started eating, quickly, desperately. Poor guy. Susan murmured. Probably been on his own for a while. Over the next few days, Charlie worked with the dog. She'd come in early, before the other volunteers arrived, and spend time with him. She'd sit near his kennel, talking softly, tossing treats. Gradually, he'd become less afraid. By the end of the first week, he'd eat from her hand. By the end of the second week, he'd let her touch him. "He likes you," Susan observed. "I haven't seen him warm up to anyone else like this." Charlie had been careful not to show it, but she felt something stirring in her chest. Something she hadn't felt in 15 years. This dog reminded her of Rex, not in appearance, but in something else. Intelligence. That look in his eyes that suggested he was thinking, processing, understanding more than an average dog. "What should we call him?" Susan asked. "We need a name for the records." Charlie had thought for a moment. "Scout. He looks like a scout." Scout it is. As Scout recovered, gained weight, his coat grew healthier, his fear faded, his personality emerged. He was smart, very smart. He learned basic commands in just a few repetitions. He figured out how the kennel latches worked and had to be moved to a more secure enclosure. He watched everything, his golden brown eyes taking in every detail of his surroundings. Charlie found herself spending more and more time with him. She'd volunteer specifically to walk Scout, taking him on longer routes than the other dogs, challenging him with new experiences. She'd hide treats for him to find, testing his nose and his problem-solving abilities. He excelled at everything. "Someone's going to adopt him fast," Marie said one day, watching Charlie work with Scout in the shelter's small training yard. "He's young, good-looking, smart. The perfect family dog." The comment had hit Charlie harder than she'd expected. She'd realized she didn't want Scout to be adopted. She wanted... number. She couldn't think like that. She couldn't have a dog. Having a dog meant caring, and caring meant risk, and she'd learned what happened when you cared too much and couldn't protect what you loved. But as weeks passed and Scout remained unadopted, somehow people would come, look at him, and then choose another dog. Charlie couldn't help feeling relieved. And she couldn't help noticing how Scout behaved around her differently than around others. He was polite with other volunteers, but with Charlie, he was engaged. He watched her constantly, seemed to anticipate her movements, responded to the slightest signal. It reminded her so much of Rex that sometimes it hurt to breathe. One morning in late October, Charlie had arrived at the shelter before dawn. She did this sometimes when she couldn't sleep, when the nightmares came back. She'd let herself in with her volunteer key and gone to Scout's kennel. The dog had been awake immediately, alert, tail wagging when he saw her. "Want to go for a walk, boy?" She'd taken him out to the training yard where the morning was just beginning to lighten. Frost covered the grass. Their breath made clouds in the cold air. Charlie had stood there, Scout sitting beside her, and she'd felt something crack open inside her chest, something that had been locked away for 15 years. "I miss him," she'd told Scout. "Every day I miss him, and I'm so sorry I couldn't save him." Scout had leaned against her leg, that same lean Rex used to do, and Charlie had sat down right there on the cold ground and cried. Scout had laid his head in her lap, and Charlie had scratched behind his ears and let herself grieve properly for the first time since Rex had died. When she'd finally stopped crying, the sun was rising. Scout was still there, patient, calm, as if he understood. That was when Charlie had made a decision, a reckless one, probably a mistake, but she couldn't help herself. "Want to learn something?" she'd asked Scout. Over the following weeks, Charlie had begun training Scout. Not officially, nothing documented, nothing anyone else knew about. She'd come in early, before other volunteers arrived, or stay late after everyone left. She'd work with Scout in the training yard or, when the weather was bad, in the storage room at the back of the shelter. She'd started with the basics she'd learned decades ago. Detection training began with a game, making the dog associate a particular scent with reward. She'd used essential oils at first, just to see if Scout had the aptitude. She'd hide cotton balls scented with lavender, then clove, then peppermint. Scout had caught on immediately, using his nose to locate the hidden scents and alerting her to their location. He'd learned his alert signal quickly, too. A calm sit, facing the source of the scent. No barking, no pawing, just the sit. Perfect. Charlie had known she was playing with fire. This was nostalgia, maybe even obsession. She was training a dog for a skill he'd never need, teaching him techniques from a life she'd left behind. It wasn't healthy. It wasn't smart. But she'd continued anyway. She'd told herself it was therapeutic, that it was helping her process her grief. She'd told herself it wasn't serious, just a game between her and a smart dog who needed mental stimulation. She'd told herself a lot of things. The truth was simpler. Training Scout made her feel like herself again. For the first time since Rex had died, she felt competent, skilled, purposeful. She'd been good at this work, had been one of the best, and Scout was proving to be an excellent student. By December, Scout could detect and alert to 6 different essential oil scents with near-perfect accuracy. Charlie had set up increasingly complex scenarios, hiding scents in hard-to-reach places, creating distractions, testing his ability to focus. He'd passed every test. "You're amazing," she'd told him one morning after a particularly impressive performance. "You know that?" Scout had wagged his tail and looked at her with those intelligent eyes, and Charlie had felt a surge of affection so strong it almost frightened her. She'd started thinking about adopting him. The paperwork would be simple. She was a trusted volunteer. And as Marie had pointed out, Scout wasn't exactly popular with potential adopters, despite his good qualities. Something about his intensity put people off. They wanted a dog that was friendly and trainable, yes, but also relaxed. Scout was too focused, too alert, too much of a working dog. But he was perfect for Charlie. She'd been working up the courage to fill out the adoption forms when everything changed. The strangers arrived in West Haven on a cold Monday in January. Charlie first noticed them at the coffee shop, where she'd stopped for her morning coffee before heading to the shelter. There were 3 of them, all men, all wearing business casual clothes that looked expensive, but somehow wrong for West Haven. They were sitting at a corner table, speaking in low voices, occasionally glancing around the shop as if checking to see if anyone was listening. Jerry, the coffee shop owner, had noticed them too. After Charlie got her coffee and sat at her usual table by the window, he came over with a rag to wipe down the already clean surface. "New faces," he commented quietly. "Came in an hour ago, ordered coffee, and have been sitting there ever since." "Business?" Charlie asked. "That's what they said when I asked. Looking at properties, apparently. Might be investing in town." Charlie glanced at the men again. There was nothing obviously wrong about them. They were just 3 people having a conversation. But something made her uneasy. Maybe it was the way they were dressed, too formal for a small town. Maybe it was how they watched the door whenever someone entered. Maybe it was just old instincts from her military days, when being alert to potential threats had been part of her job. She finished her coffee and left, putting the strangers out of her mind. West Haven sometimes got visitors, people looking for properties, tourists passing through, salespeople. These men were probably nothing unusual. But over the next few days, she kept seeing them. They were at the hardware store, talking with the owner about industrial supplies. They were at the harbor, walking along the docks, looking at buildings. They were at the diner, eating lunch and reviewing documents spread across their table. And people were talking. "Did you hear?" Marie said when Charlie arrived at the shelter on Wednesday. "Those men who've been around town? They leased the old Campbell warehouse down by the harbor." "The big concrete one?" Charlie asked. "That's the one. Been empty for 5 years, ever since Campbell Moving went out of business. The men said they're starting an import business, bringing in goods from overseas to distribute regionally. Good for the town, probably. Means jobs, economic activity." "Probably," Charlie agreed, but something still felt off. She'd gone about her usual routine at the shelter, walking dogs, cleaning kennels, but her mind kept drifting to the strangers and the warehouse. She told herself she was being paranoid, seeing threats where none existed. Just because she'd spent 25 years in a world where vigilance meant survival didn't mean everyday life required the same level of suspicion. That evening, she'd decided to walk past the warehouse on her way home. It was public property, public streets. Nothing unusual about taking a walk. The warehouse was a large, 2-story concrete structure near the north end of the harbor. It had loading docks in the back and a large rolling door in front. When Campbell Moving had operated there, there'd been trucks coming and going all day. Now it was quiet, though she could see lights on inside through the small windows near the roofline. A black SUV was parked out front. As Charlie walked past on the opposite side of the street, one of the strangers emerged from the warehouse, carrying a clipboard. He glanced in her direction, and Charlie kept walking at a steady pace, just a woman out for an evening stroll. She'd felt his eyes on her back until she turned the corner. The next day, she'd taken Scout for their morning training session, then decided to walk him around the harbor area. It was something they did sometimes. Scout enjoyed the new smells from the fishing boats and busy docks. As they'd approached the area near the warehouse, Scout's behavior had changed. His ears had pricked forward, his tail had stopped wagging, and his body had tensed. He'd slowed his pace, his nose working the air. "What is it, boy?" Charlie had asked softly. Scout had pulled toward the warehouse, straining against the leash, not in an excited way, but purposefully, as if he wanted to investigate something. When Charlie had held him back, he'd sat and looked at the building, then looked up at her. It wasn't his alert sit. It was close, but not quite. More like something interesting there, worth checking out. "Come on," Charlie had told him, tugging the leash. Not our business, but she'd filed the moment away in her mind. Scout had reacted to something about that warehouse. Given his training, it could be any strong scent: fish from the docks, diesel from boats, industrial chemicals. Plenty of things could trigger his interest. Still. Over the following week, Charlie had found excuses to walk past the warehouse at different times of day. She'd varied her routes, never passing too frequently, never lingering too obviously, just observing. The black SUV was always parked outside during business hours. Sometimes a delivery truck would pull up to the loading dock in back. She'd seen this from a distance using the binoculars she'd bought from the hardware store, pretending she was interested in bird watching. Men would unload boxes and crates, moving them inside. The loading doors would close quickly after each delivery. Nothing obviously suspicious. Just a business doing business. But the men, she'd identified 4 of them total, sometimes 5, never seemed to integrate into town life. They didn't eat at the local restaurants more than once or twice. They didn't shop at local stores. They didn't chat with people on the street. They stayed apart, separate, speaking to locals only when necessary. "Unfriendly bunch," Jerry had commented one morning. "They come in for coffee sometimes, but they don't talk. Just take their drinks and leave." "Some people are private," Charlie had said. "Sure, but even private people say, 'Thank you,' and 'Have a nice day.' These guys barely make eye contact." "Maybe they're just busy with their business." But Charlie had noticed it too. The men were careful, controlled, alert. They moved like people who were watching their backs, like people with something to hide. Or maybe she was projecting. Maybe they were just antisocial businessmen who happened to be awkward in social situations. Not everyone was friendly. Not everyone integrated into small towns easily. She'd tried to let it go, to focus on her normal life. But twice more, when walking Scout near the warehouse, his behavior had changed. That same tension. That same focused attention on the building. The second time, Charlie had let him lead her a bit closer. Scout had pulled toward a side door of the warehouse, his nose working overtime. He'd stopped about 20 feet away and sat, not quite his full alert sit, but close. Charlie had looked around. The street was empty. She'd knelt down next to Scout, pretending to check his paw, and watched the warehouse. Nothing. No movement, no sound. Just a building. "Let's go," she'd told Scout, standing up. As they'd walked away, Scout had looked back at the warehouse twice. That night, Charlie had lain awake, thinking. Scout's behavior suggested he was detecting something, a scent he'd been trained to notice. But that was impossible. She'd only trained him with essential oils, nothing dangerous, nothing real. There was no reason he'd alert to the warehouse unless there was something there that smelled similar to the training scents, something chemical, something that triggered the same response. Charlie had sat up in bed, her heart racing. This was paranoia. This was her PTSD making her see threats where none existed. This was years of military training making her suspicious of normal business activity. But what if it wasn't? Charlie had promised herself she wouldn't do anything rash. She'd observe, gather information, and if she found anything genuinely suspicious, she'd report it to the proper authorities. She wasn't a soldier anymore. She wasn't law enforcement. She was a 68-year-old woman who volunteered at an animal shelter, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Over the next 2 weeks, she'd established a pattern. She'd walk Scout past the warehouse once a day, varying the times and routes so it wouldn't seem obvious. Each time, Scout showed the same interest in the building. That focused attention, that tension, that almost alert. She'd also started gathering information more deliberately. She'd struck up conversations at the coffee shop and the hardware store, asking casual questions about the new business. "Import company," they said, the hardware store owner told her when she'd bought some supplies one morning. They ordered some heavy-duty shelving units and industrial lighting. Said they'd be storing merchandise for distribution. What kind of merchandise? Didn't say specifically. General goods, I assume. Consumer products. At the harbor, she'd talked with old Sam Tucker, who'd been working the docks for 40 years and knew everything that happened there. "Odd bunch," Sam had said, spitting tobacco juice into the water. "Their deliveries come at strange times, early morning, late evening, and they're real particular about privacy. Told me and the other dock workers to stay away from their section." Maybe they have valuable merchandise? Worried about theft? Maybe. But valuable merchandise usually means security systems, not just being secretive. And I've never seen them unload anything that looks particularly valuable, just boxes and crates, pretty standard stuff. Charlie had filed all this away. Strange didn't mean illegal. Private didn't mean dangerous, but combined with Scout's reaction. She'd decided to check county records. The town hall had a public records office where anyone could look up property information, business licenses, and other documents. Charlie had spent an afternoon there, claiming she was doing research for a local history project. The warehouse lease had been signed by a company called Northern Distribution, LLC. She'd written down the information and later searched online using the library's computers. Northern Distribution had minimal online presence, A basic website with generic information about import-export services, no social media, no reviews, no history. The company had been registered just 3 months ago. None of this was necessarily suspicious. New businesses were minimal online all the time. But combined with everything else, Charlie had made a decision. She needed to see inside that warehouse. She'd spent several days planning, observing the warehouse's patterns. The workers arrived around 8 in the morning and usually left by 6 in the evening. Sometimes one person stayed later, probably for security. Deliveries happened irregularly. She'd seen 2 in the 2 weeks she'd been watching, both in the early evening. The warehouse had several entry points: the main rolling door in front, the loading dock doors in back, a regular side door near the office area, and probably emergency exits she couldn't see from the street. The windows were too high to see through from ground level. The building was in a relatively quiet part of the harbor area. No residential properties nearby, just other warehouses and industrial buildings, most of which were empty at night. If she was going to do this, and she still wasn't sure she was, she'd need to do it at night, midweek when fewer people were around, and she'd need to bring Scout. If there was something in there that was setting off his training, he'd be able to locate it more efficiently than she could. Charlie had known this was a bad idea. She'd known she could be arrested for trespassing. She'd known she might be wrong about everything, might just be a paranoid old woman breaking into a legitimate business. She'd known she should just call the police and report her suspicions. But what would she report? That her dog acted interested in a building? That some businessmen were private and unfriendly? The police would think she was crazy. No, if she was going to make accusations, she needed evidence. And to get evidence, she needed to see inside that warehouse. She'd chosen a Wednesday night. She'd told Marie she wasn't feeling well and wouldn't be at the shelter Thursday morning, establishing an alibi, though she hated thinking of it that way. She'd dressed in dark clothes and soft-soled shoes. She'd brought a small flashlight, her phone, and a leash for Scout. At 2 in the morning, she'd driven to the harbor area, parking her car 3 blocks away. She'd walked to the warehouse with Scout, staying in shadows, moving quietly. Her heart had been pounding, part fear, part adrenaline, part something else. For the first time in 15 years, she'd felt fully alive. The warehouse had been dark and silent. She'd circled it once, checking for security systems. She'd seen cameras at the main entrance and loading dock, but the side door near the office appeared unmonitored. The door itself was locked, but it was an old-style lock, the kind Charlie knew how to pick. Another skill from her military training that she'd never expected to use again. It had taken her 10 minutes and several tries, her hands shaking, but finally the lock had clicked open. She'd paused, listening. Nothing. No alarms, no sounds from inside. "Ready?" she'd whispered to Scout. The dog had been alert, focused, clearly sensing Charlie's tension. He'd looked up at her with those intelligent eyes, and Charlie had felt a surge of affection mixed with guilt. She was bringing him into a potentially dangerous situation, if anything happened to him. But she'd come this far. They'd entered the warehouse. Part 6, Discovery. The interior of the warehouse had been dark except for dim emergency lighting near the exits. Charlie had turned on her flashlight, keeping the beam low, and looked around. The main floor was large and mostly empty. There were metal shelving units along the walls, some holding boxes and crates, but nothing like the full warehouse she'd expected. The space felt cavernous, their footsteps echoing despite her attempt to move quietly. Scout had immediately pulled toward the back of the warehouse, his nose working. Charlie had followed, letting him lead. They'd passed the shelving units. She'd shown her light on some of the boxes, seeing generic labeling. Consumer electronics, household goods, office supplies. The boxes looked legitimate, undisturbed. Maybe she'd been wrong. Maybe this was just a normal warehouse and she'd broken in for nothing. But Scout had been insistent, pulling toward a door at the back of the main floor. The door was marked Storage, Employees Only. Charlie had tried the handle. Locked. This lock was newer, more sophisticated. She'd examined it with her flashlight. Frustrated. She couldn't pick this one. She'd need a key or... Scout had whined, scratching at the door. "I can't open it, boy," Charlie had whispered. The dog had looked at her, then back at the door, then sat. His alert sit, the one she'd trained him to use when he detected the scented oils. Charlie's heart had started racing for a different reason. Scout was alerting. Whatever was behind that door, it was triggering his training. She'd looked around the immediate area, searching for another way. There was a window high up on the wall next to the door, a small window, probably for ventilation. It was dirty and covered with mesh, but she'd moved a nearby shelf unit, positioning it under the window. It wasn't stable, but it would hold her weight briefly. She'd climbed up carefully, her knees protesting. She was 68, not 28, and examined the window. The mesh was old, rusted. She'd worked at it with her fingers, and eventually it had come loose. The window itself was latched but not locked. She'd managed to open it, creating a gap about 2 feet square. Tight, but she could fit. Probably. "Stay," she'd told Scout, and he'd sat obediently at the base of the shelving unit. Charlie had pulled herself up, harder than it used to be, her arms not as strong, and squeezed through the window. She'd scraped her side on the frame and landed awkwardly on the other side, barely catching herself before falling. She'd stood in the darkness, breathing hard, and found a light switch. She'd hesitated. Turning on lights was risky. Someone might see them from outside. But she needed to see what was in here, and her flashlight wouldn't be sufficient. She'd flicked the switch. Fluorescent lights had buzzed to life, revealing a smaller room about 20 feet square. This space was fully utilized. Shelves lined every wall, and a workbench sat in the center. And everywhere, there were chemicals. Charlie had moved closer, reading labels: fertilizer, diesel fuel, acetone, hydrogen peroxide, aluminum powder, sulfuric acid. None of these were illegal individually. They had legitimate uses. But together, in these quantities, in a locked room, these were precursor chemicals, materials used to make explosives. Charlie's military training had come flooding back. She'd recognized the combinations immediately. With these materials, someone could make ANFO, ammonium nitrate/fuel oil, TATP, triacetone triperoxide, or several other types of improvised explosive devices. Her hands had started shaking. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't imagination. This was real. She'd pulled out her phone to take pictures, documenting everything: the chemicals, the labels, the quantities. She'd photographed the workbench, which held measuring equipment, mixing containers, and what looked like timing devices. That was when she'd heard the door to the main warehouse open. Charlie had frozen, her heart stopping. Voices, male voices, speaking in low tones. Someone had come back to the warehouse in the middle of the night. The people who'd rented this space. The people who'd stockpiled these chemicals. She'd turned off the light immediately and crouched behind the shelving unit, trying to think. She was trapped in this room. The only way out was through the door, which led directly to the main warehouse where the voices were coming from, or back through the window. The window. She had to go back through the window. She'd moved as quietly as possible, climbing onto the workbench, reaching for the window. She'd pulled herself up, harder this time, her muscles already tired from the first climb, and squeezed through. Her jacket caught on the frame, and she'd had to yank it free, making a noise. "Did you hear that?" one of the voices said, much clearer now, much closer. Charlie had dropped to the floor on the other side, landing badly, pain shooting through her ankle. Scout was there immediately, whining softly. "Go," she'd whispered, grabbing his leash. "Go! Go!" They'd moved toward the main entrance, but lights were coming on throughout the warehouse. She'd heard footsteps, multiple people spreading out. "Check the storage room," someone commanded. Charlie had looked around desperately. The main entrance and loading docks were too exposed. She'd spotted another door, the one marked "Emergency Exit Only." It would probably have an alarm, but she was out of options. She'd pushed through the door, and immediately a shrill alarm had sounded throughout the warehouse. But she'd been outside, running despite the pain in her ankle, Scout running beside her. Behind her, she'd heard shouting, footsteps. She'd run through the dark harbor area, dodging between buildings, heading away from where she'd parked her car. She couldn't lead them to her vehicle. She'd needed to lose them first. Scout had kept pace with her easily, and Charlie had been grateful for every morning walk, every bit of exercise she'd maintained over the years. She was old, but she wasn't frail. She could run when she had to. She ducked behind a storage container at one of the other docks, pulling Scout close, covering his muzzle gently so he wouldn't bark. She'd listened, trying to hear over the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Voices in the distance, a car engine starting, headlights sweeping across the harbor area. She'd stayed hidden for what felt like hours, but was probably 20 minutes. Eventually, the sounds had faded. The alarm at the warehouse had stopped. Silence had returned to the harbor. Charlie had waited another 10 minutes, then carefully made her way back to her car, taking a circuitous route, staying in shadows. Her ankle was throbbing. Her side hurt where she'd scraped it on the window frame, and her hands were still shaking. But she'd made it. She'd driven home, parked in her garage, and sat in the car for a long time, Scout in the passenger seat, both of them breathing hard. She'd broken into a warehouse and discovered evidence of explosives manufacturing. She'd been caught in the act and had barely escaped. The men who'd rented that warehouse now knew someone was onto them. This was bigger than she'd imagined. This wasn't just a suspicious business. This was serious criminal activity, maybe even terrorism. She needed to call the police. Right now. She needed to report what she'd seen. But if she called the police, she'd have to admit to breaking and entering. She'd have to explain how she knew what those chemicals were, which would mean revealing her military background. She'd have to explain about Scout's training, which would raise questions about why she'd been training a shelter dog in detection work. More importantly, would the police believe her? She was a 68-year-old woman who volunteered at an animal shelter. She'd broken into a business based on her dog's behavior. Yes, she had photos, but she'd obtained them illegally. Would they even be admissible as evidence? And if the men in that warehouse realized the police were coming, they might destroy the evidence, might disappear, might accelerate whatever they were planning to do with those explosives. Charlie had sat in her car thinking, her mind working through possibilities the way it had when she'd been in the military and faced with complex tactical situations. Finally, she'd made a decision. She needed help, but not from local police. Not yet. She needed someone who would understand the implications of what she'd found. Someone who could mobilize the right resources. Someone who'd take her seriously despite her illegal methods. She needed to contact the FBI. Charlie had spent the rest of that night researching on her computer. The FBI had a field office in the nearest major city, about an hour's drive from West Haven. They had a website with contact information, including a tip line for reporting suspected criminal activity. But Charlie didn't want to leave a tip. Tips could be ignored, could get lost in the system, could take days or weeks to investigate. Based on what she'd seen in that warehouse, they might not have days or weeks. She'd looked up the field office's direct number and decided to call in the morning, to speak with an actual person, to make sure someone understood the urgency. But she'd needed sleep first. She'd taken Scout, who she'd officially decided to adopt right then and there, filling out the mental paperwork in her mind, inside, given him food and water, and collapsed into bed. She'd dreamed of Rex again, but this time the dream had been different. In this dream, Rex was sitting calmly, looking at her with those knowing eyes, and Charlie had understood. This was why she was still here. Not to hide from her past, but to use it when it mattered. She'd woken at dawn feeling exhausted but clear-headed. She'd called in sick to the shelter again. This was becoming a pattern, and she'd need to explain eventually. And at exactly 9 o'clock, she'd called the FBI field office. FBI, how may I direct your call? I need to report a suspected explosives manufacturing operation, Charlie had said, keeping her voice steady. There had been a pause. Please hold. She'd been transferred twice before reaching someone who introduced himself as Agent Michael Torres. Ma'am, you said you have information about explosives manufacturing? Yes, in West Haven, about an hour north of you. There's a warehouse at the harbor. I have reason to believe someone is making improvised explosive devices there. What kind of reason? This was the tricky part. I saw the materials myself. Fertilizer, diesel fuel, acetone, hydrogen peroxide, aluminum powder, timing devices, all the precursors for ANFO and TATP. Another pause. Ma'am, how did you see these materials? Are you an employee at this warehouse? No. I entered the warehouse and observed a locked storage room containing these items. You entered? With permission? No. So you're admitting to breaking and entering? Yes, Charlie had said. I know I broke the law. But Agent Torres, I also know what I saw. I have photographs. And I know that those materials, in those combinations, are used to make explosives. I know because I spent 25 years in the military as an EODK-9 handler. I know what bomb-making materials look like. This time, the pause was longer. Your former military EOD ? Yes, sir. Sergeant Charlotte Greer, retired. I can provide my service number and records if needed. Agent Torres's voice had changed, become more focused. Okay, Sergeant Greer. I'm going to need you to tell me everything from the beginning. Charlie had spent the next hour on the phone explaining the whole story. The strangers arriving in town, Scout's behavior, her observations, her decision to investigate, what she'd found, the near-miss escape. She'd sent the photos from her phone to the email address Agent Torres provided. When she'd finished, Torres had been quiet for a moment. This is serious, Sergeant. If what you're saying is accurate, we're looking at a major operation. But I have to be honest, the fact that you obtained this evidence illegally complicates things. I understand. But the evidence exists regardless of how I obtained it. You can get a warrant now, based on my testimony. I'm willing to testify to what I saw, to accept whatever legal consequences come from my actions. It's not that simple, but let me make some calls. Can you stay by your phone? Yes, sir. Good. I'm going to contact my supervisor and our local terrorism task force. This is potentially a national security issue. We'll likely need to meet with you in person, get a formal statement. And Sergeant? Yes? Thank you for coming forward. If you're right about this, you may have prevented something catastrophic. After hanging up, Charlie had sat with Scout, waiting. The dog had seemed to sense her tension and stayed close, his head resting on her leg. Her phone had rung 2 hours later. Agent Torres again. Sergeant Greer, we're taking your report very seriously. I'm coming to West Haven with a team. We need to conduct surveillance on this warehouse, verify your information, and plan an approach. Can you meet us at the West Haven police station in 2 hours? The police station? We'll need to coordinate with local law enforcement. They'll be read in on the situation. I know you were reluctant to involve them, but for an operation of this scale, we need their cooperation. Charlie had agreed. 2 hours later, she'd walked into the West Haven police station for the first time in the 12 years she'd lived in the town. The station was small. West Haven wasn't a high-crime area. Chief Williams was a man in his mid-50s who'd been chief for 10 years and knew everyone in town. He'd looked confused when the desk officer brought Charlie to his office. "Miss Greer? I know you from the shelter, don't I?" "Yes, sir. I'm here because—" The door had opened, and Agent Torres had entered, along with 2 other people in business attire. Torres was younger than Charlie had expected, maybe 40, with dark hair and sharp eyes. He'd introduced his colleagues, Agent Lisa Park and Agent James Crawford, and they'd all sat down. Chief Williams had looked even more confused. "What's going on?" Agent Torres had explained, showing the photos Charlie had taken, outlining the situation. The chief's expression had changed from confusion to shock to concern. "A bomb-making operation? In my town? I had no idea." "No reason you would," Torres had said. "These people are professionals. They chose a small town specifically because it's easier to operate under the radar. Ms. Greer's discovery was lucky, and her military background meant she recognized what she was seeing." The chief had looked at Charlie with new eyes. "Military? I didn't know." "I don't advertise it," Charlie had said quietly. They'd spent the next 3 hours planning. The FBI couldn't move on the warehouse immediately. They needed proper warrants, needed to conduct their own surveillance, needed to identify everyone involved. Torres had estimated it would take at least 48 hours to prepare. "In the meantime," he'd told Charlie, "you need to maintain your normal routine. Don't do anything that might alert these suspects that we're onto them. Can you do that?" "Yes." "And Ms. Greer?" "No more solo investigations. What you did was brave, but incredibly dangerous. These people are dangerous criminals, possibly terrorists. If they'd caught you—" "I know," Charlie had said. "I won't do it again." But she'd known she'd already done the dangerous part. Now it was just a matter of waiting. The next 48 hours had been some of the longest of Charlie's life. She'd returned to her normal routine, volunteering at the shelter, walking dogs, tending her garden, while knowing that just a few blocks away, FBI agents were conducting surveillance on the warehouse. She'd officially adopted Scout, finally filling out the paperwork. Susan had been delighted. "I was hoping you'd adopt him," the director had said. "You two are perfect for each other." If she only knew, Charlie had thought. At home with Scout, Charlie had been unable to stop thinking about what was happening. Agent Torres had called once to update her. They'd confirmed activity at the warehouse, identified 4 individuals coming and going, and were working on identifying them through facial recognition and other means. They'd also gotten the warrants they needed. "We're planning to execute the warrants tomorrow morning, early," Torres had said. "Be ready. We may need you to answer questions or identify locations within the warehouse." That evening, Charlie had tried to relax, but she'd been too wired. She'd taken Scout for a long walk, deliberately avoiding the harbor area. The last thing she needed was to be spotted near the warehouse right before the FBI raid. As they'd walked through the quiet streets of West Haven, Charlie had reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few weeks. She'd come to this town to escape her past, to live quietly, to never use her military skills again. And yet, here she was, involved in an operation that could have come straight from her service days. Maybe you never really left that life, she'd thought. Maybe it's always part of who you are. She'd gone to bed early, but barely slept. At 4 in the morning, her phone had buzzed with a text from Agent Torres. Operation beginning at 6 a.m. Stay available. She'd gotten up, made coffee, and waited. At 6:15, her phone had rung. Sergeant Greer, we have a situation. Charlie's heart had sunk. What kind of situation? We executed the warrants. The storage room is exactly as you described, full of explosive precursors. But there's something else. We found evidence that the subjects were planning an operation for today. There's a timing device that appears to be active, set for noon. We're evacuating the area, but we need EOD specialists here immediately. A timing device? Active? Charlie's military training had kicked in immediately. What does it look like? Torres had described it. A digital clock face connected to a circuit board, wires leading to what appeared to be detonators. That's a simple time delay trigger, Charlie had said. Standard setup for a timed detonation. Have you contacted military EOD? They're on the way from the nearest base, but it'll be 2 hours. We have 6. And Sergeant, there's more. We found partial plans indicating there may be additional devices. The subjects fled when we arrived. We're searching for them now. But if there are other devices set to detonate at the same time, Charlie had understood immediately. 6 hours to find and disable multiple explosive devices with military EOD 2 hours away. That left a critical gap. I can help, she'd heard herself say. Sergeant, you're retired. You're not certified for this anymore. The liability? I'm the most qualified person in this town right now. I've done this work for 25 years. And if there are more devices, every minute counts. There had been a long pause. Can you get to the warehouse? I'll be there in 10 minutes. Charlie had driven to the harbor, Scout in the passenger seat. She'd told herself she was bringing him for emotional support, but she'd known the truth. If there were additional devices, Scout could help locate them. The harbor area had been transformed. Police cars and FBI vehicles blocked the streets. Officers were setting up a perimeter, evacuating nearby buildings. Agent Torres had met her at the barrier. Sergeant Greer, are you sure about this? No, Charlie had said honestly, but I'm doing it anyway. She'd been suited up, body armor, communications equipment. Someone had found an old EOD suit, though it didn't fit perfectly. Charlie had looked at it and shaken her head. These suits are psychological more than protective. If a device goes off, we'll know about its suit or not. I need mobility more than armor. She'd settled for the armor vest and proceeded to the warehouse. Inside, the scene was controlled chaos. FBI agents were documenting evidence while trying to stay clear of the storage room. An agent showed Charlie to the device. It was exactly as Torres had described, a digital clock showing 11:42 a.m. connected to a circuit board and wires. The wires led to several blocks of what looked like plastic explosive. Charlie had taken a breath and steadied herself. This was it. This was what she'd trained for, what she'd done hundreds of times before Rex. Number. Don't think about Rex. Focus. She'd examined the device carefully, not touching anything yet. The setup was relatively simple. A timer triggering a current through the detonators, which would ignite the explosives. The challenge was that tampering with the circuit could trigger the detonators immediately. I need complete silence, she'd said into her comm. Everyone out of the building except essential personnel. The warehouse had cleared. Charlie had been left with one FBI tech specialist who was recording everything on video. She'd spent 10 minutes just looking, tracing the wires visually, understanding the circuit. Her hands had been steady. Surprising, given how they'd shaken during training with Scout. But this was different. This was real. This was what she knew. The clock had read 11:33 when she'd made her first move, carefully clipping one wire. Nothing. She'd breathed. Next wire. Nothing. The third wire had been trickier. It was attached to what looked like an anti-tamper switch. If she cut it wrong, it could trigger the device. She'd examined it from every angle, and then she'd remembered a similar setup from a training exercise years ago. She'd cut it. Nothing. At 11:47, she'd disabled the final connection. The clock was still counting down, but it was no longer connected to the detonators. The device was safe. Clear, she'd said into her comm. Cheers had erupted outside the warehouse, but Charlie had stood up, looked around the storage room, and said, "We need to find the other devices. Scout can help." They'd brought Scout into the warehouse. Charlie had put him in his working mode, focused, serious, and given him the command to search. Scout had immediately begun working, his nose moving systematically across the space. Agent Torres had watched with obvious skepticism. "You really think a shelter dog can find explosives?" "He's not just a shelter dog," Charlie had said. "I trained him. And yes, he can." Scout had alerted in the storage room, expected, given all the explosive materials there. But then he'd alerted at a crate in the corner that Charlie hadn't examined closely. She'd opened the crate carefully. Inside was another device, similar to the first, also set for noon. She'd disabled it using the same method as before. "Okay, I'm impressed," Torres had admitted. Scout had continued searching the warehouse and alerted twice more. One device hidden in a ceiling panel, another buried in a pile of legitimate shipping materials. Both were disabled. At 11:58 a.m., Charlie had sat down on a crate, exhausted. 4 devices, all disabled. 4 potential catastrophes prevented. "Is that all of them?" Torres had asked. "I don't know," Charlie had admitted. "The only way to be sure is to search every building in the vicinity. If they were planning something big." Torres had made a decision. "We're evacuating a 3-block radius and conducting a full sweep." "Sergeant, you and Scout up for helping?" Charlie had looked at Scout, who'd looked back at her with those intelligent, trusting eyes. She'd thought of Rex, of the last mission they'd done together, of how it had ended. This was different. This time she knew what to watch for. This time she was prepared. "We're up for it," she'd said. Over the next 3 hours, Charlie and Scout had searched 6 buildings in the harbor area. They'd found one more device, in a dumpster behind another warehouse, obviously meant to cause maximum chaos when it exploded. By 3 o'clock, they'd cleared every structure in the evacuation zone. No more devices were found. "I think that's all of them," Charlie had said. 5 total. That's a lot of explosive potential. What were they planning? "We're still piecing that together," Agent Park had said. "But based on the placement, it looks like they wanted to destroy evidence of their operation and cause maximum disruption to the harbor, possibly to cover their escape." "Have you found them? The suspects?" 3 of the 4. Still searching for the leader, but we'll get him." Charlie had been driven back to the police station, where she'd given a formal statement. The FBI agents had been effusive in their thanks, and even Chief Williams had seemed awed. "I had no idea we had someone with your background in town," he'd said. "You're a hero, Ms. Greer." "Just doing what needed to be done," Charlie had said, uncomfortable with the praise. She'd gone home finally at 6 o'clock, Scout beside her. She'd fed him, fed herself, and collapsed on the couch. She was exhausted, sore, and emotionally drained. But she'd also felt something she hadn't felt in 15 years. Pride. She'd used her skills to save lives. She'd faced the fear that had haunted her since Rex's death, and she'd come through on the other side. Scout had curled up next to her on the couch, and Charlie had scratched behind his ears. "You did good today, boy. Rex would have been proud of you. I'm proud of you." The dog had thumped his tail against the couch cushions. That night, Charlie had slept without nightmares for the first time since the accident. The story broke the next day. A major explosive-making operation broken up in West Haven. 5 devices found and disabled. 4 suspects in custody, 1 still at large. And at the center of it all, according to the news reports, a retired military EOD specialist who happened to live in the town. Charlie's name was kept out of the initial reports at her request, but in a town the size of West Haven, secrets didn't stay secret for long. By that afternoon, people knew. Marie Patterson had called, tearful and amazed. "Charlie, I had no idea. All this time and you never said anything." "It was in the past," Charlie had explained. "I wasn't hiding it, exactly. I just didn't talk about it." Jerry from the coffee shop had given her coffee for free when she'd gone in the next morning. "On the house," he'd insisted. "And for the record, I always knew there was something special about you." The attention had been overwhelming at first. Everyone wanted to talk to her, to thank her, to hear the story. Charlie had tried to deflect, to minimize her role, but people wouldn't let her. The West Haven Gazette had run a front-page story with the headline, "Local Hero Stops Terrorist Plot." They'd used her name, with her reluctant permission, and included her full military background. The article explained how she'd noticed suspicious activity, investigated, contacted the FBI, and then helped disable the explosives. What the article didn't mention was the guilt Charlie still carried about breaking into the warehouse. Agent Torres had assured her that any charges would likely be dropped given the circumstances, but it still bothered her. "You did the right thing," Torres had told her during one of his follow-up visits. "Yes, you broke the law, but you also saved potentially dozens of lives. Any prosecutor with a conscience will take that into account." The suspects had been identified as members of a domestic terrorist organization with anti-government views. They'd been stockpiling explosives, with plans to attack multiple targets, not just the harbor. The devices Charlie had disabled were meant to destroy evidence and create chaos, while the group escaped to carry out more attacks elsewhere. "You didn't just stop one attack," Agent Park had explained. "You disrupted their entire operation. We've been tracking this group for months, but we didn't know where they were operating from. Your discovery led us right to them." The 4th suspect, the leader, had been captured a week later trying to cross into Canada. The entire cell was now in federal custody. At the shelter, Susan had organized a celebration in Charlie's honor. The volunteers and staff gathered in the break room, where Susan presented Charlie with a plaque that read, "To Charlotte Greer, who showed us that heroes can come from anywhere, even from our own community." Charlie had been embarrassed, but touched. She'd given a short speech, thanking everyone for their support and emphasizing Scout's role. "I couldn't have done it without him," she'd said, gesturing to Scout, who was sitting calmly by her side. "He's the real hero," Susan had laughed. "Then I guess we should give him a plaque, too." They'd done exactly that, a dog-sized plaque that read, "Scout, Honorary EOD Dog, West Haven Animal Shelter." Scout had sniffed it curiously when Charlie showed it to him, tail wagging. Over the following weeks, life in West Haven had gradually returned to normal. The news crews left. The FBI finished their investigation and moved on to other cases. The warehouse was emptied and sealed as evidence. But some things had changed permanently. Charlie was no longer just the quiet woman who volunteered at the shelter. She was Charlie the hero, Charlie the veteran, Charlie who'd saved the town. People treated her differently, with more respect, more interest. Some of it made her uncomfortable, but she tried to accept it graciously. She'd also become more open about her past. She'd had coffee with Chief Williams and told him about her military service, about Rex, about why she'd come to West Haven. He'd listened without judgment. "You were looking for peace," he'd said, "and you found it for a while. I'm sorry it was disrupted." I'm not, Charlie had surprised herself by saying. I thought I wanted to forget my past, to bury it. But what happened showed me that the past isn't something to forget. It's part of who I am. And sometimes, the things we've learned, the skills we've developed, they matter. They can make a difference. She'd started having coffee with other veterans in town. There were more than she'd realized, mostly retirees like herself. They'd formed an informal group, meeting weekly at Jerry's coffee shop. They talked about their service, their struggles adjusting to civilian life, their experiences. I spent so long trying not to be Sergeant Greer anymore, Charlie had told the group one morning. I just wanted to be Charlie, nobody special. But what I learned is that I'm both. I'm Charlie and I'm Sergeant Greer. Both are part of me. One of the other veterans, a former Marine named Frank, had nodded. I get that. I tried to leave the military behind when I retired, but it's always there. The question isn't whether it's part of you, it is. The question is how you integrate it into your new life. Exactly, Charlie had said. 3 months after the incident, Charlie had gotten a call from Agent Torres. Sergeant Greer, I have a proposition for you. Are you interested in consulting work? Charlie had been in her garden, planting tomatoes for the coming season. Scout was lying in a sunny patch of grass, watching her work. Consulting? What kind? The Bureau is always looking for experienced EOD specialists to help train our agents and analysts. Most of our people are great at investigation, but they don't have hands-on experience with explosives. We'd like you to come in occasionally, maybe once a month, to give lectures or conduct training exercises. Paid work, of course. Charlie had considered it. She'd retired from the military specifically to get away from that world, from the stress and danger and trauma. But this would be different. Teaching, not doing. Passing on her knowledge to others who might need it. Let me think about it, she'd said. She'd spent a week considering the offer. She'd talked to Scout about it during their walks. He'd become her sounding board, patient and non-judgmental. She'd talked to her friends at the coffee shop, who'd all encouraged her. You'd be perfect for it, Marie had said. And it's not like you'd be going back into danger. Just teaching. Teaching what I learned over 25 years, Charlie had mused. Passing it on so it doesn't get lost. She'd thought about Rex, about all the missions they'd done together, all the knowledge she'd accumulated. Rex was gone, but what he'd taught her, about dogs, about working with them, about trusting their instincts, that knowledge didn't have to die with him. She'd called Torres back and accepted the offer. Her first training session had been in May. She'd driven to the FBI field office with Scout because she'd insisted that any EOD training should include K-9 elements, and spent a day teaching a room full of agents about explosive detection, device identification, and safety protocols. She'd been nervous at first, but once she'd started talking about something she knew so well, the nerves had faded. She'd shown them photos from her service days, carefully selected to avoid classified material. She'd demonstrated Scout's training and abilities. She'd fielded questions and shared stories. This is incredible, one young agent had said during a break. This is real-world experience we can't get anywhere else. After that first session, Torres had asked her to come back monthly. She'd agreed, and it had become a regular part of her life. 1 week a month, she was EOD Specialist Greer again, teaching and training. The rest of the time, she was just Charlie from West Haven. Back in town, she'd also started a new program at the shelter, a proper working dog training course. Susan had been enthusiastic. Not all dogs are suited to be pets, Charlie had explained. Some have too much energy, too much drive. They need jobs. I can evaluate them and train them for working roles. Therapy dogs, service dogs, and yes, detection dogs. Then we can partner with organizations that need these kinds of dogs. The program had started small, with just 2 dogs, but as word spread, other shelters in the region had started sending their difficult-to-place dogs to West Haven. Charlie evaluated them, trained those with potential, and placed them with organizations. One dog, a energetic Belgian Malinois mix named Thunder, had ended up with a police department 2 hours away as a drug detection dog. Another, a focused border collie named Pixel, had become a search and rescue dog with the state's emergency management agency. "You're giving these dogs purpose," Susan had said, watching Charlie work with a new candidate one morning, "and probably saving their lives. A lot of these dogs would have been euthanized at other shelters." "Everyone deserves a chance to do what they're good at," Charlie had replied, "dogs included." Scout had become something of a celebrity in town. People knew him as the dog who'd helped find the explosives, and children would ask to pet him when Charlie walked through town. Scout took it all in stride, patient with the attention, but clearly happiest when it was just him and Charlie working together. For Charlie, life had found a new balance. She still had quiet days tending her garden and reading books. She still had her routines, her coffee at Jerry's shop, her friends in town. But she also had purpose again. Teaching, training, using her skills to help others. The nightmares about Rex had changed. She still dreamed about him sometimes, but now the dreams were different. Instead of watching him run toward the bomb, unable to stop him, she dreamed about the good times. Training sessions where Rex had learned a new skill, missions where they'd worked perfectly together, quiet evenings when he'd curled up next to her. She'd realized something important. The trauma of losing Rex had overshadowed all the good memories. For 15 years, she'd associated her EOD work with pain and failure. But that wasn't the whole story. Most of her work had been successful. Most of the time, she and Rex had done their jobs perfectly, saving lives and preventing disasters. "I'm sorry I forgot that," she'd said one evening, standing in her backyard with Scout, looking up at the stars. "I'm sorry I let your death define everything." "You deserved better than that, Rex. You were a good boy, the best." She'd felt something lift from her chest, not the grief, which would probably always be there in some form, but the guilt. She'd done her best. Rex had done his best. Sometimes, despite everyone's best efforts, things went wrong. That didn't negate everything that had come before. A year after the incident at the warehouse, West Haven held a ceremony at the town hall. Agent Torres attended, along with several other FBI officials. Chief Williams was there, as were Marie, Susan, Jerry, Amy, and what seemed like half the town's population. They'd installed a plaque in the town hall lobby, commemorating the event and thanking Charlie for her service to the community. The mayor gave a speech about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Torres spoke about the importance of vigilance and community involvement. Several people thanked Charlie personally. When it was Charlie's turn to speak, she'd stood at the podium with Scout sitting calmly beside her. The town had made an exception to their no dogs in public buildings rule for the occasion and looked out at all the familiar faces. "Thank you all for this honor," she'd begun. "But I want to be clear about something. I'm not a hero for doing what I was trained to do. I'm not special for using skills I learned over 25 years of service. What I did was simply apply my experience to a situation that needed it. What I've learned this past year is that we all have skills, experiences, and knowledge that can matter. We all have something to contribute to our communities. For me, it was EOD training. For others, it might be teaching or cooking or listening or 1,000 other things. I came to West Haven 12 years ago trying to escape my past. I thought my military service was something to leave behind, something that had caused me pain and loss. What I've realized is that our pasts aren't separate from our presents. They're part of us. The experiences we've had, the things we've learned, the people we've loved and lost, they shape who we are. I lost my partner, Rex, 15 years ago. That loss devastated me, but Rex taught me so much about dedication, about trust, about doing important work. By trying to forget him, I was dishonoring his memory. This past year, with Scout's help, I've learned to remember Rex properly. Not just his death, but his life, his skills, his importance. So thank you for this recognition. But the real thanks should go to all of you. You welcomed me into this community. You accepted me without needing to know my history. You let me heal in my own time and in my own way. And when it mattered, you trusted me to help, even though I'd kept so much of myself hidden. West Haven is home now, not because it let me hide from my past, but because it let me integrate my past with my present. Thank you for that. The applause had been long and genuine. Afterward, people had lined up to talk to her, to shake her hand, to thank her again. Scout had received his own share of attention and treats. That evening, back at home, Charlie had sat in her backyard with Scout, watching the sun set over her garden. Her tomato plants were thriving. The zucchini was getting out of control, as it always did. Everything was peaceful, normal, good. "We did okay, didn't we?" she'd said to Scout. The dog had thumped his tail in agreement. Charlie had thought about the journey that had brought her here. From Montana farm girl to military sergeant. From EOD specialist to retired veteran. From traumatized survivor to functioning member of a community. From someone trying to forget her past to someone who had learned to embrace it. She'd thought about Rex, about all the missions they'd completed, all the lives they'd saved, all the skills she'd learned. She'd thought about Scout, about how training him had helped her heal, about how his intelligence and dedication reminded her that working dogs were special creatures deserving of respect and purpose. She'd thought about the warehouse, about those tense hours disabling the devices, about facing the fear that had paralyzed her for 15 years and coming through on the other side. "Life is strange," she'd said to Scout. "You think you know how things are going to go and then everything changes. I thought I'd live quietly here for the rest of my life. I thought my EOD days were over. I thought I'd never work with another detection dog. And look at us now." Scout had put his head on her lap, and Charlie had scratched behind his ears, that universal dog signal for affection and approval. She'd thought about what came next. More training sessions at the FBI field office, more dogs to train at the shelter, more quiet mornings with coffee and books, more walks through West Haven with Scout, more friendships with the people she'd come to care about, more integration of who she'd been with, who she was now. The past wasn't something to escape from or something to be trapped by. It was simply part of the journey, lessons learned and carried forward. "Rex would have liked you," she'd told Scout. "He would have appreciated your work ethic, your intelligence. And I think he'd be proud that I'm still doing this work, even if it's different now. Teaching instead of doing. Training instead of deploying. Passing on what I learned so it helps others." The sun had set completely, stars emerging in the darkening sky. Charlie had remembered another night 15 years ago, lying in a hospital bed in Germany, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she'd ever feel whole again. She hadn't felt whole for a long time, but now, sitting in her garden with Scout beside her, she'd realized she was closer than she'd been in years. "Come on, boy," she'd said, standing up. "Let's go inside." They'd walked into the house together, Charlie and Scout, two partners with a shared purpose, living in a small town where the past and present had finally made peace. 2 years later, Charlie Greer turned 70 in the small house on Maple Street. She'd insisted on no fuss, But her friends had other ideas. Marie and Jerry had organized a surprise party at the shelter, decorating the volunteer room with streamers and balloons. There was cake, presents, and a card signed by what seemed like every volunteer and staff member. "Speech!" someone had called out. "I'm not giving a speech at my own birthday party," Charlie had protested, but she'd stood up anyway. "Fine. I'll just say this. Thank you all for 2 years of friendship, support, and understanding. Thank you for not treating me differently after everything that happened. Thank you for letting me be part of this community. And thank you for all the work you do for the animals. It matters more than you know. More applause, more cake, more celebration." Scout, now 3 years old and fully trained, had attended the party as the guest of honor alongside Charlie. Several of the dogs Charlie had trained over the past 2 years had come with their new handlers. Thunder, the drug detection dog, Pixel, the search and rescue dog, and 3 others. It had been a reunion of sorts, the dogs greeting each other like old friends. Later, after the party, Charlie and Scout had walked through town. It was a route they took often, familiar and comfortable. Past Jerry's coffee shop, past the library, past the town hall with its plaque, down to the harbor. The warehouse had been purchased by a legitimate company and renovated. It was now a storage facility for a boat manufacturer busy with workers and activity. No trace remained of what had happened there 2 years ago. Charlie had paused at the spot where Scout had first alerted to the building, where this whole adventure had started. "You knew something was wrong," she told the dog, "before I did. You trusted your nose and your training. That's what saved everyone." Scout had looked up at her with those intelligent eyes, tongue lolling in a doggy smile. They'd walked further, to a bench overlooking the water, Charlie's favorite spot when she needed to think. She'd sat down, and Scout had settled at her feet. The harbor had been peaceful in the late afternoon light. Fishing boats were coming in with their catches. Seagulls wheeled and called overhead. The water lapped gently against the docks. Charlie had pulled out her phone and opened her Photos app. She'd scrolled back to photos from her military days, pictures she'd avoided looking at for years but had recently started revisiting. There was one of her and Rex, both younger, both in uniform, standing in front of their deployment unit's vehicle. Rex was sitting at attention, and Charlie was kneeling beside him, one hand on his shoulder. Both of them were looking at the camera, serious and professional. "I miss you, old friend," Charlie had said quietly. "Every day. But I'm okay now. Better than okay. I found purpose again, just like you'd want. And I found Scout, who reminds me of you in all the best ways. I'm still helping, still using what we learned together. I'm teaching others so they don't have to figure it all out from scratch. I'm training dogs so they can do the important work you did. I'm living, Rex, really living, not just existing. I hope wherever you are, you know that. I hope you're proud." A breeze had blown across the water, carrying the salt smell of the sea. Charlie had sat there for a long time, remembering, grieving, but also celebrating. Celebrating a life well lived, Rex's and her own. Finally, she'd stood up. "Come on, Scout, let's go home." They'd walked back through West Haven as the sun began to set. People had waved and called out greetings. "Happy birthday, Charlie. Enjoy your evening. See you tomorrow." Home. The word had a different meaning now than it had when she'd first arrived in this town 12 years ago. Then, home had been a place to hide, a refuge from painful memories. Now, home was where she belonged, where she was valued, where she could be her whole self, past and present integrated. That evening, Charlie had sat in her living room with Scout curled up beside her on the couch. The working dog training program at the shelter was thriving. Her monthly training sessions with the FBI were going well. Her garden was producing more vegetables than she could eat, so she'd started bringing the extras to the senior center. Her friendships in town had deepened. Life was good, not perfect. Life was never perfect. She still had occasional nightmares. She still mourned Rex. She still carried scars from her military service, both visible and invisible. But she'd learned something important. You didn't have to be undamaged to be whole. You didn't have to forget the past to move forward. You didn't have to be invulnerable to be strong. You just had to be willing to keep going, to use what you'd learned, to help where you could, and to let others help you when you needed it. Not a bad life, Charlie had said to Scout. Not bad at all. The dog had thumped his tail in agreement, and Charlie had smiled. Outside her window, West Haven settled in for the night. A small town on the coast, unremarkable in most ways, except that it was home to people with their own stories, their own struggles, their own skills and experiences. And among them was Charlotte Greer, 68 years old, no, 70 now, former soldier, current dog trainer, occasional FBI consultant, and most importantly, a member of the community who'd learned that the past didn't have to define you, but it could certainly help you when it mattered. Scout shifted on the couch, getting more comfortable, and Charlie scratched behind his ears one more time before reaching for her book. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new moments of purpose and connection. But that was tomorrow. Tonight she was just Charlie, at home, at peace, with her dog beside her, and her whole life, past, present, and future, finally fitting together in a way that made sense. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most. And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.